Welcome to SchneiderB FM. This is the podcast to help you use the internet to market your school in order to achieve your enrollment goals. I'm your host, Brendan Schneider. Welcome to episode 16, where my guest today is Dana Nelson Isaacs, who's the founder and president of DNI Consulting. Dana is a former school person who about 5 years ago went out on her own. And in our conversation today, we're going to talk about really exciting stuff. It's really about using data in your admission office. Specifically, it's about using demographic data and psychographic data to form personas, targets, and then you can use to create targeted messages to attract the people to your school that you need and want to attract. But before we get started, let me share a word from our sponsor. This episode of SchneiderB FM is sponsored by the VirCon 6, which is my school marketing virtual conference. The VirCon 6 will take place live on October 13th and includes 9 school marketing experts teaching and sharing actionable tips that will help you become a better school marketer. Your registration includes access to the live presentations as well as all the recordings. I've tried sincerely to make this conference an incredible value because you can also share the recordings with your entire team. To see who the presenters are and their topics, please check out www.vircon6.com. That's VIRCON6.com. Hi, Dana. Welcome to SchneiderB FM.
Hi, Brendan. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm very excited you're here. But before we get started, for people who might not know you, can you talk a little bit about your background? Introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I am the product of independent schools and got into admission work right out of college. I really wanted to make an independent school education available to as many students as possible. So it really felt like a soul job for me, SOUL job. And I worked in enrollment and marketing for about 15 years. And then 5 years ago, started my own consulting company. And as part of that work, I'm the coordinator of the Bay Area Directors of Admission Group, which is a consortium of about 75 schools in the San Francisco area. I really understand that enrollment managers are typically totally overwhelmed. So in my company, I help them and their teams connect the dots, stop throwing spaghetti against the wall, which seems to be a common frustration, and really try to create data-driven strategies. I'm really passionate about the work that schools are doing, and I want to support those enrollment managers who are probably tasked with major financial goals and not quite enough time or brain space to do it all. So that's what I'm up to.
That's great. And I'm excited to have you on today because one of the things I've been talking about, one of my goals, although it seems like for the last few years now, is to get better with data. And I know that's one of your specialties. So our conversation today really flows out of a question from the Facebook group. So let me read the 2 questions and then we'll jump in. So the first is, do you think data science has big impacts on new student recruitment? And the follow-up from the Facebook group was, how do you apply data science in the admission office? So in terms of the first question, do you think data science has big impact on new student recruitment? The answer is?
Yes, I certainly think so.
Of course. So let's jump into that big, hairy second question. How do you apply data science in the admission office? How would you answer that?
Yeah. So I think we all know that over the last 10 years or so, there's been a huge push to use more data in all areas of school life with benchmarking and spreadsheets. They're sort of all the rage at this point. In terms of understanding customers and the market, there are lots of types of data available. I focus on 2 types of quantitative data in most of the work that I do. And that data is demographics and psychographics. And I think that people are familiar with demographics, who the buyer is, how old they are, how much money they make, et cetera. Psychographics refers more to the why behind the buy. It really fills in that hazy outline of a demographic. And the psychographic data allows us to understand attitudes, opinions, buying habits, values. So the combination of those 2 types of data can help schools create extremely specific, nuanced, targeted strategy to try to attract the most mission-appropriate families. And if you were to augment that quantitative data with more qualitative data, the strategy becomes even more nuanced and specific. So I think that by understanding what audiences are really caring about, schools can be really specific with their messaging. So like for an example, some psychographic segments care a lot about community activism and the arts, and others might really care about technology and environmental education, and some prefer to be wined and dined, and others prefer lower key events. So if we understand these things, then we can talk to those people more effectively and see better results in those key audiences that we're trying to attract.
Oh, that was huge and very exciting.
It is really exciting.
So the logical extension from that work or that work that you do is that people can use that to hone their messages to attract these audiences?
Exactly. So if we know that there are people out in the community that want to be wined and dined and that really care about activism and athletics, then a school can create events and vehicles that are going to attract those people, both attracting them to school programming that relates to the topics they're interested in, but also positioning themselves as a thought leader in certain areas or having guest speakers in certain areas. So rather than just the throw spaghetti against a wall and say, well, we know that at, X school, we do the arts really well, so we're just going to talk about our arts program. That's great. And I'm sure that there's an audience for the arts program, but the audience you're trying to attract more of may not need to hear about the arts. They may need to hear about these other things. And so if we know that, if we know who's out there, then that messaging can be much more specific and targeted. It's a huge money saver.
Yeah. So it could further reinforce the families that you already have and want to get, but it can also open up new markets. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. It's super exciting because if we take the families who are currently enrolled in your school, and I often say birds of a feather flock together. So if we know that people in your school tend to fall into, segments 1, 2, and 3, and we know that you're doing really well with the 1, 2, and 3s, I can tell you using psychographics what 1, 2, and 3 care about from, more of a 30,000 foot view, and then say to you, great, keep doing that. But hey, there's also a huge community in your town or in your city or in those 10 zip codes that you want to attract from. And they actually are falling more into segments 10, 11, and 12. And here's what they care about. And so you can specifically talk to them.
Oh, that's cool.
It's very cool.
Yeah,
it's
that's
very
cool. So further applications, so use messaging, check. And then you mentioned creating events or potentially creating content.
Yeah.
Right? And then what are the other potential applications, or is that kind of it?
Well, that's kind of it, but it can go as deep or as wide as you want. So like I work with some boarding schools, for example, who are trying to decide where to travel. So if we study, 10 cities, I can tell you this one's worth your time and this one's not worth your time because of the intersection of the demographic picture as well as the psychographic. So don't bother going to area X, go to area Y. And here's how to talk to the people in area Y. So that would be another application. Okay. Or another good application would be for message testing or program testing.
Yes,
that's another application. It's a very specific targeted strategy as opposed to a really broad, I'm just going to try to get to everyone. And it's also a really beautiful marriage between looking internally at who the school is and then looking externally, as many brilliant colleagues have said, the intersection between mission and market. It's very important. And only looking internally and saying, well, this is who we are and who we want to be and what we want to say out there is really only one part of the picture. The other picture is, what do people need to hear? And rarely does a school have to change what they're offering. It really has to do with what the message is focused on.
Yeah. God, there's a lot there. And so good. It's so good. And I also, I know at my school and I've talked to colleagues at other schools, there's also an aspirational quality where we're going. And I wonder, so there's messaging there. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I have so many thoughts. Like I'm thinking, you could take some of that information and put it in, Google ads or Facebook ads and test messaging. And
yes. In fact, I have a client who I heard anecdotally, they cut their pay per click price in half on Facebook because they were able to get so nuanced in their messaging that they attracted all the right people. So their pay per click went down.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's really cool.
Yeah, that's super awesome. Okay, so I'm sold, but can anyone do this? Do they need help? I mean, besides hiring you?
Yeah. So
how does that work?
Yeah, it is doable on your own, especially if you have a staff member who's particularly good with data and has the time and the headspace to really devote to it. Demographic data is available all over the place. The census, for example, you can do a Google search and get you a long way. The NAIS Demographic Center is an incredible resource if you're an NAIS member.
Mm-hmm.
The psychographic data is a little bit harder to come by.
Mm-hmm.
I use a company called Onyx, and there are a few of them out there, these major marketing companies, and they have a lot of free resources on their website. What's not on their website that's free is the values piece. So they'll give you for free, like you can type in a zip code and get a general sense of who lives in a zip code with sort of a general description of a segment, but it doesn't tell you a lot about what they care about. So that's what's missing in the free version. To me, getting help's a good idea under a couple of conditions. Like if you're a super small shop, I mean, you just don't have time to do this.
Sure.
Or if the results sound really great, but doing the work sounds overwhelming. But I kind of feel like the most important reason to get help would be to synthesize the information because it's one thing if we're talking about like, well, let's just study the city of Austin. It's another if you say like, hey, I want to study 30 zip codes and there are 5 demographic factors and 20 market segments to look at. Suddenly that's a lot of data. So having someone to help bring it all together, I think is the most useful, but it definitely is possible to do by yourself.
Okay. Just a reminder, if you're listening right now, if you're in the car or out for a walk, any of the resources that Dana or I mentioned will be in the show notes. So URLs and other resources will be there so you don't have to remember.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's a question that popped into my head. Are these like developing personas?
Yes, they are like developing personas. Yeah. So there are a few ways to develop personas, and you don't have to use the psychographic segmenting to do it. You can use it. You can do it by putting your current families who you like and you want to emulate into various buckets and creating personas that way. Mm-hmm. The way that I use the psychographic segmenting to create personas is I bring segments together that have values or opinions or lifestyles in common and where there's market availability in your area. So, for example, let's take the Austin example. Let's say we find out that the school has 10% of their school population falls into segment 3 and segment 4, but in the region, 50% of the population falls into segment 3 and 4. So we would say there's market available there, and I would create a persona of segment 3 and 4, which happen to have a lot of qualities in common, and tell you about what messages and what vehicles or events are going to, sort of quote unquote, feel good to those people. And so in a report that I deliver, you end up with maybe 3 to 5 personas, depending on what we're studying. And if you were doing it on your own, you could do the same thing where either you're getting the segment data and pulling the information together, or if you were using like survey data from your school or literally just looking at a family list and making some buckets, you could do the same thing. Like, well, what do these people care about? How do they best respond to what we put out? Where are the communities that they're attached outside of our school community and so on? So I would aim for, somewhere between 3 and 5 personas so that you know who you're talking to. Yeah,
that's really cool. And I know when we first did our persona work, and I guess this goes back to, schools can do this by themselves, but having an expert like you to help connect the dots, because when we first did our persona work, we used all these, and I think you and I have probably talked about this before, we used all these qualities and put families in buckets, but then the end result for some of these qualities were that they weren't actionable for us. We couldn't use them. They didn't mean anything. So it's like, and
it's so painful.
It is painful. And I guess it was a good exercise to go through from a team perspective because it involved marketing and admissions and a lot of, different people that were literally around the table. But then at the end of it, we were like, I can't believe.
Yeah. So, it's one thing to end up with a list of qualities, and then it's another thing to end up with an understanding of how to actually reach those people. Yeah, so like the segment descriptions, not all of them do this, but some of them tell you this segment is a more avid podcast listener. So for a school that's trying to attract that audience, they might have been thinking like, maybe we should do a podcast. And there's some data that says, yes, that is worth your effort. Or another segment that uses public transportation more often than other segments would be a good vote for advertising and more traditional methods on public transportation options. Whereas other segments are like, don't bother with any of that stuff. These people are all about being wined and dined and feeling personally attached to a place and et cetera, et cetera. So that's where the action is and not just a list of qualities.
Oh, that's key. That's the whole That's huge. That's huge. You alluded to something, and I wanted to come back to because I'm sitting here thinking about if you're a small shop,
Yeah.
one or two people, and you have multiple segments. You had said, I think in your Austin example, if someone's in segment 2 and 3, 10% of their current population, but you'd mentioned that there were 50% in the market.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you use the word capacity?
I think I said market share.
Market share. So I guess if I'm a small shop, I could get these and you would help or say, okay, these are the segments you need to pay attention to versus these right now?
Yeah, exactly. So the way it works is your current family addresses get uploaded into the system. And depending on what your needs are, we can upload only families that are full pay or only families from certain areas or whatever, like whoever you want more of. So we upload those, we get a report back that says what segment every person or every household falls into. And then we compare that to who's in the geographic region that we're studying. And we can get as nuanced as a census block, which I don't actually recommend, but you can get very specific,
Yeah.
or you can go as broad as like a county or city limits or that type of thing, or a CBSA, a core-based statistical analysis, which is a census term.
Yeah.
But we pre-decide which areas we're going to study, and then we're able to use the analogy of if you in Austin have 10% of your families in segment 3 and 4, but 50% of the population falls into 3 and 4, I would say you have some market available. Whereas if those numbers were flipped, 50% of your school is segment 3 and 4, but it only makes up 10% of the area population, I'd say you're good. You've captured market share.
Yeah, so go to another segment.
Yes, which doesn't mean to ignore those segments because those segments are obviously really attracted to your school. But in terms of where you might put resources, both financially and time-wise, there might be other segments that are similar to those, but that you're not reaching as well.
Okay. So let me shift gears a little bit. Okay, so you've piqued my interest. I'm a small shop or even a big shop. I want to dip my toe in the water. I'm not ready to get outside help.
Yeah.
But, what's one thing that a school could do or one thing that a school could do to get started?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would do is get really familiar with the demographic and the demographic projections that, again, are available on NIAS or through census material, because those market conditions are things you have no control over, and it's a good idea to know what's coming. So just that information alone can help plan for, everything: staffing changes, tuition assistance messaging, class size planning, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I would start there. From the psychographic point of view, I would either go exploring on these segments, either with Environics or someone else, and start to play around with getting an understanding of what the segments might be like in your school, and think about developing personas that sort of mirror those segments rather than starting cold, because the segments give you a great starting place. And if you can put in a zip code where you have a lot of families, you'll learn a lot about who's there just by reading the free resources. So I would start there.
Okay, that's great advice. I'm actually going to do this tomorrow.
Great. Let me know how it goes.
I will. I'll probably end up calling you anyways. But that's now you mentioned Environics. Is a service like Claritas?
Yes, same kind of deal. So these companies all have their own systems, but yes, it's the same.
Okay. I was just wondering. Someone had mentioned that. Again, because this is one of those things I honestly don't know a lot about. And
there is a lot that's available for free. And if you have a really handy data-driven person on your staff, or even I heard about a school over the summer that used a math teacher that just was super interested in this and, spent a summer or something really playing with these numbers. It's doable to get pretty far on your own. At some point, you end up having to invest some money, because if you're going to upload your addresses, that has a cost attached to it. Okay. And then it's called the social values index. That has a cost associated that I have a license for. So unless you're going to buy a license, you're better off getting some help. But you can get pretty far without either of those things.
Okay. No, that's good advice. So can you share an example or a couple examples of results you've seen from schools doing this work?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned like the boarding school travel planning. That's huge. And sometimes boarding schools will call and say, hey, I've got some board member that's breathing down my neck about why we don't spend more time in Chicago. Like, can we just look at Chicago, please? And so it's it's great to be able to go back to that board member and say, here's the data. School age kids are going down, income levels are going up. There's no market segment opportunity for us there. We're better off going to Tampa, and being able to make a case for that. So that's really exciting and saves a lot of money and energy going to the wrong places. Transportation planning, like looking at a day school, 20-mile radius, we can see which areas are best to invest in. Another example would be like I worked with a day school a couple of years ago that was considering adding a boarding component, and they wanted to do market research on cities within a 5-mile drive time. And it was a huge savings of dollars when we recommended not to do it for a variety of market condition factors. Or like another school is really struggling, needed to figure out what to do with their building lease. And we were able to confirm for them that their student body size was not likely to increase enough to maintain the building, best to let it go. So that is another kind of result. Or like the Facebook ads thing I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And then more qualitatively, we've seen huge increases in scores on surveys regarding people's experience in the admission process, because if you talk to them in a way that works for them, they're happier. So that's been great. Admission officers have more data backing up their decisions around event planning, messaging, and so on. A school last year told me they saw a 35% increase in their applications, which was, that's a lot.
Who wouldn't take that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, stronger applicant pools, better yield, and so on. I think just avoiding the hunches and the anecdote and having real data is something that quantitatively is hard to measure, but qualitatively I think gives enrollment managers an incredible amount of confidence and allows them to move forward with their plans for the year, feeling like they know what they're up to and they're not just guessing.
That's huge. And the first example you offer to have with the trustee in Chicago, because I'm sure we've all had similar or somewhat similar experiences to that, to have data to go back and offer a reason why not, besides a hunch, and then say go to Tampa would be huge. That's great. Okay, Dana, you said something that kind of piqued my interest. So it sounds like admission officers aren't the only people that would hire you based on, size of school and business leases. Is it business managers and heads of school, other people as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So admission offices are often really excited by this work. So it's common that I hear from them first. But I do hear from directors of marketing. I hear from communications people. I hear from heads of school, and I hear from board members. So it kind of depends on what's going on, but any of those people might reach out. And business managers, I don't hear from quite as often, but certainly once in a while I do. Sometimes it's like the admission officer has said something to a business manager and then the business manager makes the phone call. Yeah. So it just depends. But yeah, it's such an important piece of research to be doing in order to use dollars effectively to get the best results, that everyone at school gets really excited about the idea of having this kind of information available.
And then kind of an extension of that, is it the admission office for like this work that we're talking about? Is it the admission office hiring you or the marketing person or both?
Well, it's both or either or the head of school. Okay. So it depends. Yeah. Most often it's the admission office. And I've seen most admission offices, what happens is they end up sharing some budget line with marketing to pay for it. And sometimes they end up using heads discretionary also. So it sort of depends on where we are in the year and what the situation is, but it's often a combination between admissions and marketing.
Okay, great. So as we work toward wrapping up, Dana, I want to shamelessly plug the fact that Dana will be presenting in more detail on this at the VerCon 6 coming up in October. And I'm actually super pumped to see and hear this presentation, so I'm excited. But where's the best place for listeners to find you?
I'm also excited about the VerCon 6, so thanks for having me. My website is the best place to find me, and that's dniconsulting.biz. And I think we'll put that link in the show notes. And I'm also on Twitter at @DNelsonIsaacs. We'll put that in too. And I love talking to people, even if you are not interested in hiring me at all. I just love to help people plan their research, really beginning with the end in mind, making sure that you're addressing the questions that are really top of mind for your school. So feel free to reach out anytime. And I love to just chat with people about it.
Awesome. Dana, thank you so much for spending some time. And I'm looking forward to the presentation at the VerCon. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. But before you go, can I ask a favor? I would love for you to leave an honest review of this show on iTunes. Reviews are the way that more people can find the show and we can get the word out and we can help more people market their school. I've made it easy for you, so if you go to SchneiderB.com/iTunes, it'll take you right where you need to leave the review. So thanks very much, and until next episode.